Okay, so this is the screenshot of the whiteboard image that I was referring to in the last tutorial. So what you can see then is how the stories are going to be set up. So far, if you notice in our ArchiCAD file, we only have one story, okay, which is, I'll just open this up a little bit better, which is site level AHD. On site level AHD, which is this story, so from sea level, which is AHD, or AHD stands for Australian Height Datum or Project Zero. So this is the surveyor's zero, and we've discussed this briefly in class, but AHD is important to be a unified or a universal 0 point for all surveyors, so that the contours of your site that are requested on the survey that you request for your site is consistent or comparative, or for want of a better word, relative to other properties. So if your surveyor is any good, he's going to reference all his relative levels or his RL levels to Project Zero or AHD. It means that when you've got a building right near sea level, you know that it's right near sea level because the AHD or at zero means that the RL levels will be roughly close to zero. Whereas if you then have a comparative site that is on top of a hill, for example, then of course the relative levels or the contours that are indicated on your survey for that property will be whatever is the height of that hill. Okay? So at the moment in our ArchiCAD file, we only have site level AHD. What we will be doing is inserting a basement story, a ground story, a roof story, a basement story, a ground floor story, a first floor story, and a roof story. So then what will happen is we will have these stories inserted here, and then we will be able to build the building on the relevant stories for our project. So for example, we will then build the car park on the basement story, the ground floor on the ground floor story, the first floor on the first floor story, and the roof on the roof story. Now, these dimensions are, if you recall from the brick rod tutorial, these dimensions are in reference to the brick rod heights for the courses of brick. And I mentioned that 2914 is a very common brick course height because it fits very conveniently to a 3 meter clearance for your stories to take into account slab thicknesses, and also the standard dimensions of many common types of materials. For example, plasterboard, which is typically 1,350 mils as one sheet. So 2 sheets is 2,700 mil, which fits very nicely when we're considering from floor to ceiling. Okay, so the underside of where this slab would be. Now, this 2,400 is to indicate that perhaps if we were to consider doing most of the basement wall as concrete block, then the concrete block heights, which we discussed as 190 plus 10 mil for the mortar joint, would then fit very comfortably into a 2,400 height concrete block wall. And then this distance here from the top of the concrete block to the underside of where the ground floor story would be is 514, which is also very convenient 6 courses of brickwork. And we discussed this briefly in a previous tutorial as well. So if you can imagine then, with the assistance of this screenshot of the whiteboard, that we are going to next try to achieve this story setup in ArchiCAD. Now, The story setup is going to be fairly straightforward in that we are now discussing very specific story heights or relative levels between each story. What we do need to consider, though, in addition to this setup of the stories is, well, what is the base level of the car park going to be? Now, that requires looking at the car parking provisions, because in the car parking provisions, there are things to consider such as what is the distance from the site boundary to the entrance of your building, and what is the appropriate slope of the car park ramp or the driveway that leads to your building from the boundary edge or from the street, and what is that going to be? Is it going to be, for example, a 1 to 10 maximum slope or a 1 to 12 maximum slope? It means that the base level of the car park is going to be dictated by the length of the driveway. And I'll explain that in more detail in the next video tutorial, but this is something to start keeping in mind on, because whilst these story settings that you're seeing in front of you on this whiteboard are I'm fairly comfortable with these, but where in relative space does this sit? Is AHD at 0? Which obviously it's not, because otherwise our building would be at sea level. But we know that we've been building our site survey. If you remember the site survey way back in week 1, the site survey, if you note the spot levels on the site survey, they are more like 99,000 mil or 100,000 mil. So obviously this AHD at Project Zero isn't going to be at 0. This whole building needs to be given an appropriate base level for the basement car park. Okay, so I'll discuss that in another tutorial, but now's the time to bring out the car parking provisions that we talked about in class and to have a read about the car parking provisions. If you haven't got them, they are available to you on the City of Sydney website, and we've discussed already about the DCP and the LEP provisions. The car parking provisions are in the DCP, okay? So it's time to go and look at the DCP, and at the same time, look at the floor ratios, the floor space ratios, and other definitions of what is gross floor area and what is landscaping area. And we'll revisit these terms in tutorials to come.